Thank you very much, Harry, as well as to Paul and Paul for having me. It's an absolute delight to be here. So news, for better or worse, shapes how we view, understand, and interact with the world around us. And together with my colleagues, we've used this simple insight that news helps shape our beliefs to shed new light on an old question, which is what are the effects of corruption? Now, before I go to why we're actually revisiting this question now, let me give you the standard boilerplate IMF response here in terms of the disclaimer. And I've amended it slightly to say that this absolutely does not represent the formal views of the IMF. So to the extent that anything gets written about this, hopefully I won't lose my job because I've done this part of it. So now coming back to why we're studying corruption right now. Well, it remains highly relevant and macro-critical. According to Transparency International's International Corruption Perceptions Index, in 2017, 2/3 of economies were considered moderately to highly corrupt, and none achieved a perfect score. Now, unfortunately, corrupt actors go to great lengths to keep their corrupt activities hidden, and that makes measurement of corruption and its effects inherently difficult. Now, prior literature has tried to improve upon such measures, including this one, but those still fall prey to numerous critiques. And so what have we done and how have we done it? Well, first, we develop a big data cross-country news flow measure of corruption. We call that the NIC, as well as the anti-NIC for anti-corruption. And we argue that this addresses several weaknesses in the literature. Second, we examine whether news about corruption seems to be macro-relevant for the variables that we consider most important, namely growth. And we find that, yes, it does seem to have a persistent impact on growth outcomes over a 2-year period. And then finally, we kind of turn that coin around and we say, what about anti-corruption efforts? Every other year, governments come out, either running for elections or in the middle of contentious terms and say, we're launching a large anti-corruption campaign. We want to see if those are effective and whether they actually engender positive macro outcomes out of those. We find that on their own, absolutely not, but when they pair them with the harder work of institutional strengthening, we do tend to see some feedback, positive loops come out of that. So within the broader literature, we place corruption-related indices into 3 generations, the third being unified by its use of big data, and that's where the NIC fits in. That first generation is going to be those perception-based indices, and that includes the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is the most widely used, but also Control of Corruption, which others have heard of. The first generation went from mere perceptions to actual experiences with corruption. So there it was based on victimization surveys as well as institutional quality indicators like judicial independence or fiscal efficiency. And then within this third generation, these big data measures, you have India's IPayToBribe.com. So this is a self-reporting site, it's anonymous, where citizens can go on and report their experience with bribery at the very, very local level all the way up to the national level there. You also have procurement analyses that are conducted by the likes of the World Bank as well as Ernst & Young and many others, where governments hand over troves of procurement data, and there they're looking for statistical outliers or shifts in patterns around political shifts in regime to proxy for corruption. Now, 2 questions that naturally came up when we undertook this endeavor was, 1, do we actually purport to directly measure corruption? No, we do not. We only say that we measure news flow about corruption. And then a natural follow-up is, if we're only saying that we're measuring news flow, why would news flow about corruption actually matter, especially for macro outcomes? Well, the idea that news matters is very well founded in the literature. So of course, within corporate finance, you have Fama's seminal theory, but also within behavioral economics, we've seen that news has persistent impacts on both the beliefs as well as the expectations and behaviors when it comes to voting, consumption choices, saving, and even with respect to family choice sizes. And then finally, more recently within macroecon, including the work of Laura Valkamp, who's right here at Columbia Business School, we found that we can actually intuitively model these belief formation processes, embed them in larger macro models, showing that large shocks to beliefs can generate persistent scarring effects in the longer run, even with respect to growth outcomes. And so in our particular instance, intuitively to make that connection, our shocks to beliefs are going to be around these corruption-related news shocks, which should change the underlying understanding and extent of the beliefs of agents on the ground of what corruption looks like in these countries. There, of course, is many uses of news chatter beyond what we've done here. There's a broader policy uncertainty literature, which connects to my broader span of work, and that is Baker, Bloom, and Davis as well. News chatter has also been used to measure sentiment as well as sovereign risk. Everybody in the room kind of is aware of this, given that it's a news conference. But there's also a smaller literature that actually does directly relate corruption to news. Largely, this is country specific. And so in the case, for example, of this Spanish paper, Costas Perez looks at land use scandals in that country, and they use the number of articles about these scandals as a way to get a proxy of the intensity of information transfer, seeing how that links to voting outcomes in that instance. Goel et al. Used search engine results using a pretty simple algorithm of just searching for corruption, bribery, and the country's name. Now, methodologically, unfortunately, they're not able to distinguish between corruption and anti-corruption, and nor can they also pick up how many false positives are actually getting in these like millions and millions of search results that come up. So how did we create the measure? Well, we started with 665 million articles, and this is using Factiva's Dow Jones News Aggregator Index, which has 36,000 different sources around the world. We then constructed country-specific search algorithms, and this was with the help of journalists as well as professors of journalism. And then the nice thing about being in the fund is I can talk to country experts from all over the world, and they also help discipline our dictionary, if you will. So we have a mention of country, and that needs to come within 8 words of a mention of corruption. There are 18 such related corruption words. It also needs to mention public sector, because we're taking a definition of corruption as being public abuse for private gain. We limit it to major sources. There's a current conversation around the veracity of news media, and so by limiting it to major news sources that people are well aware of, that helped deal with that critique. But it also dealt with strange compositional effects of the coverage of Factiva and making sure it wasn't aggressively biased towards any one country as well. We only allowed for articles over 99 words, and that was so that we could conduct human audits ourselves, also kicking out ticker articles, but getting a sense of the underlying nature, sourcing, and timing of the corruption scandals that are showing up in our indices. We remove own country sources for reasons that I'll explain in just a moment. And then there can be no mention of anti-corruption. This was to encourage unidirectionality of the measure, in that when we see an increase in the count of articles, that's because there's an increase in corruption-related stories, not because government's launching a really major anti-corruption effort. The sample covers 30 economies from 1995 to 2017. It's broadly split across the world with a little bit of bias towards Asia. Not only is that my department, but also Asia tends to be understudied in the context of corruption. There's also an argument on the part of the authorities that in Asia, corruption's different because it greases the wheel. And so we wanted to make the point that no, even in your context, there does seem to be some negative effects from corruption. And then we do 3 extensions to our standard measure. We do a core measure. So a lot of those 18 words could be wobbler words in the sense that they don't just pick up corruption, this public abuse for private gain, but also just criminal activity. And so we selected a parsimonious set of core words like nepotism, kleptocracy, unimpeachable words, if you will, to make sure that we were getting specifically at corruption and being able to compare those two. We also did a lobbying extension. So when we met with country experts, especially the low-income ones, they said this is biased against our countries. Sure, corruption is illegal everywhere, but there's a particular brand of corruption that's absolutely legal in advanced economies, but it wouldn't be picked up by things like bribery, or scandal. So the way that we got at that is that by extending the dictionary. So we added words like money politics, revolving door, and lobbying to get at that. And then we finally have an anti-corruption one, which is meant to proxy these anti-corruption efforts. And for all of these extensions, we also coverage adjust to make sure that's comparable across countries and across time. So we get it wrong sometimes. And here are some of the examples of that. So in the top one, you see information about just common criminals, although they got took 12 million, and they pretended to be officials from the Chinese ministry. And so there we're, again, not getting at this definition of corruption, which is public abuse for private gain. And then the second one, a US regulator was filing charges against Goldman Sachs, and the regulator wasn't actually the one that was engaged in the fraudulent activity. But of course, we often do get it right. And so here are 3 examples, all from the Asia region. So in the first one, you see Indonesian workers being targeted for extortion by officials from the ministry. In the second, you see a big bribery scandal in India. And then the final one, you see an infrastructure scandal in the Philippines involving their senators. And so the natural question, of course, becomes, how often are we getting this right versus getting this wrong? Are we actually picking up some zeitgeist of what's happening in these countries with respect to corruption? And so for that, we ran a pretty extensive human audit, and then you see the results here. On the left-hand side, we asked for the NIC, is it getting it right about the correct country? Is it getting it right about corruption? And yes, you see that by and large, we are absolutely getting it right. Of that subset, is it about the correct country and corruption? Is it about a decrease or increase? So going back to that question of unidirectionality that I was trying to get at, and absolutely, we do seem to be getting the direction right. When you see an increase, it is because there's actual cases going upwards, not downwards. It did actually tend to be about actual corruption, and we didn't actually anticipate this going in. We weren't sure if journalists were going around and putting a mic in front of somebody and saying, hey, what do you think of the current regime? Are they corrupt or not? And people were like, yeah, I think this person is corrupt. We actually found that in the vast majority of cases, it's actually picking up actual cases. So indictments, for instance, arrests, and it wasn't just the general opinions of people posturing about what might be going on. There's an emerging literature within the corruption space that talks about supply-side corruption. So this is foreign governments as well as multinationals going into countries and engaging in corrupt practices. And the argument there is that those countries are just passengers in this broader international corruption. And so we asked this question when we were going through the human audit, is it domestic source or is it this international supply side source? And we tended to see that actually by and large it is domestic sources still, although you do see some foreign entities showing up. And then finally, related to political economy, there's the argument that any time the opposition wants to kind of put a dagger in the back of the ruling party, they just claim that they're corrupt. So around elections, around any policy, they just want to say, hey, well, those guys are corrupt, so you should vote for us. But we only found mention of opposition in under 10% of cases. Turning to the anti-NIC audit, we also see that those results tend to be really strong in terms of being correct and being about anti-corruption. Now, interestingly here, we found that it's an even split between specific targeted anti-corruption efforts and very general, broad proclamations by government. And again, these tended not to be at least reported as being related to any kind of opposition or political purge relationships. Now, stepping back, our measure does have some advantages relative to the existing literature, including to that third generation of those big data approaches, but also some limitations, and we've attempted to address those limitations, and I'll talk about some of the refinements I've done there. On the advantages side, the nice thing, even relative to iPayToBribe.com or to the procurements data, is that we don't need to rely on government handing over these troves of data, and you can also think that there's probably some endogeneity there, right? In the sense that governments that are willing to hand over that data probably are confident that you're not going to find too much, or you're going to find stuff against people that did things in the past. And so we don't want to rely on that mechanism. We also don't need to rely on unvetted reports. And this is the nice thing about using journalism, is because it is such a competitive industry, editors as well as journalists themselves stake their claim on their reputation for not only getting it right, so having vetted articles, but also being timely in terms of maintaining their competitiveness and market share. To that point, we also find that it's far higher frequency relative to existing perceptions-based measures. So we see a ton of variation in our measure, whereas with perception-based indices over a 20-year period, it's barely moving by 1 point. Now, news is also incredibly salient for economic actors in the same way that you and I open the newspaper each morning or scroll, I guess, more reasonably. So do central bankers, so do ministers of finance, so do investors, so do CEOs. So it's very intuitive in terms of the link in that way. Moving to the limitations side of it, the press freedom and repression was our major one. And we really grappled with this for months in terms of what adjustments to make to deal with this. So to the extent that you have citizens that are unable to exercise freedom of speech, or journalists that are unable or unwilling because they themselves are corrupted to actually critique the government, then we're going to tend to underestimate the extent of corruption in those countries. And so in order to combat that, we've done two things. The first is to remove those own country sources, and that's to get rid of some of that local bias that could occur. Now, it also achieves a second point, which is that in some countries, there's no systemic corruption, but the local media is overly sensitive to any type of corruption story because there's an absence of it. And so it ends up being quite noisy, and it also helps remove the noise in that way. The second thing we did is that we upweighted country years using civil liberties indices and press freedom indices, with the idea being that if you are only able to get, for example, 2 stories out of North Korea in a particular year relative to 2 stories out of the US, it's probably reasonable to say that there's higher corruption in North Korea relative to the US. And I just want to show you kind of what that looks like across the various measures, including the 2 lobbying and core extensions here. So all the way on the left-hand side, you see the baseline, and I'm just showing examples. So a low-income developing economy, an emerging market, and then an advanced economy in green. And then going from the baseline to the lobbying one, you see that there's actually, counter to your priors, a decrease in that advanced economy's corruption relative ranking, and the EM goes up slightly. Now going to core, it goes up a bit for the advanced economy, up a bit for that lower income economy, while the EM stays broadly the same. But then you start to see a major adjustment going to press freedom and the civil liberties, which also, of course, tend to be pretty correlated in terms of those measures. So the LIC stays largely the same, low income country. The AE stays largely the same, but you get this huge bump up in this EM that we've selected. So in that country, over our sample period, there was a lot of press freedom and repression there, which really does change the relative ranking, which is what we like it to do. The second main hurdle was that journalists only like to cover new news. And we're talking about international journalists. So if we have a case like Cambodia, which ranks at the top of these indices all the time, are international journalists willing to go back again and again and again and tell the same story about Cambodia still remaining corrupt? And one way that we tried to get at this of whether we could make relative comparisons or not was to compare the levels of the NIC to alternative measures of the corruption. And this wasn't to endorse a particular measure or even to place weight on relative rankings. However, we do see a very, very strong correlation, which does suggest in part that we might be getting the relative levels correct over time. And even looking at some countries like Cambodia and the time series over the full sample period, you actually do see ongoing international news coverage of corruption instances on the ground there. Now, perhaps more interestingly here, is that we actually find that our NIC does have predictive power over these perception-based indicators, which again kind of cements our framing in terms of this belief formation process. There's news out there in the world that shifts beliefs, and then it filters into macro outcomes. So that was a good thing to see in terms of coming out of the data. Shifting to macro relevance, we first compared levels of the NIC to structural variables over time, showing that it absolutely ran in line with our priors across a whole slew of different variables. I'm just showing a couple here, but we do see that a higher NIC is associated with less competitiveness. A higher NIC, i.e. more corruption, is associated with lower judicial independence, ease of doing business, regulatory quality, fiscal efficiency, and if you name it, those relationships are broadly lining up. Now, if you go back to the way that I framed this theoretically, I talked about shocks. I talked about belief revision, specifically from large shocks. And so what we've done to empirically and intuitively model this belief formation process in our context is we've taken changes in the NIC over time. We call that the NIC stock. And then we take shocks to that NIC stock as those event dates. And the idea there is that small increases and decreases over time aren't going to shift beliefs in a major way that'll filter at least into macro outcomes. Maybe you'll get pricing and high frequency financial effects, but not in terms of macro outcomes. So we want to pick up specifically those really, really large scale shocks that are going to drive those belief revisions. And we're going to look at those in the context of event studies as well as panels. So standard stuff here. So on the event studies, we do see that it turns up out in the short term as well as the long run in terms of negative effects. So you see this increase in stock market volatility. After period zero, you see this depreciation in exchange rates. You also see, so we've done this for abnormal returns as well as standard returns. You do see the dip in the initial period with some mean reversion thereafter. Shifting towards longer term outcomes, you do see a drop in portfolio investment in the initial period with considerable volatility thereafter. You don't see as much on FDI, which is in line with our expectations. Tax revenues tend to fall off, and then you see this persistent slump in GDP, in terms of growth at least. Now, these, I think, while visually compelling, are problematic in many ways in that they don't control for a number of confounding factors that are happening at the same time. We also, of course, have the global financial crisis happening during the time. There are oil price shocks. So for that, we take it to panels and control for all the usual suspects. And we do see that that growth effect does actually tend to stick and tends to be very robust. So we can throw in other institutional variables in there in terms of controls. We can control for anti-NIC, so anti-corruption activities. And really, we've kind of thrown everything at this and found that this 2-year period, roughly 3 percentage point impact, tends to actually hold up. We then split the sample into high NIC and low NIC cases and found that this seems to be driven by the high NIC cases, by these highly corrupt instances. So how do we interpret this? Well, corruption is very detrimental to trust, but there also seems to be this interaction with the level of trust. So if you're in a high NIC country, that also tends to be correlated with low trust. And there, agents might say, hey, there's this major country-specific shock, but we don't think that government's able or willing to actually effectively counter it. Whereas in low NIC countries, high trust countries, you tend to see these shocks, including in the likes of, for example, Korea, right, where a leader is actually removed from office. And yet there is this sense that the underlying institutions will handle it, that the judicial system is strong enough to handle it. And so you don't see the same belief revisions and the outcomes on the macro side. Now let me pause here and talk about a couple more things, namely endogeneity, and then also the channels that this might be operating through. So on the endogeneity side, the nice thing about using news chatter is that journalists don't tend to kowtow to the wills of politicians, especially international journalists. They have independence both in that they're less likely to face retaliation on the ground, and they also have their own independent resources in terms of funding. They also tend to have larger investigative units as well, and so for several reasons, we don't actually expect there to be any endogeneity in terms of them listening to politicians on the ground, in terms of saying push off the story. We also looked at correlations with business cycles, with political cycles, and didn't see anything show up there. And then finally, we used the traditional IVs that are used in this literature, so ethno-linguistic diversity and ethnic conflict, and they're incredibly, incredibly weak instruments. They have no predictive power at all on our NIC index. And then secondly, on channels, so you might have heard me in the introduction, I said this is early stage work, and this is why I say that we still are not wildly clear on what the channels are. So I told you a story about trust, but we don't know how that's operating. There is an increase in borrowing spreads. We do see the financial effects, but we're not getting anything in terms of bite when we actually take that to more rigorous approaches econometrically. And so there is this question mark that we're still investigating of trying to actually drill down what the nuances of the channels of how they filter up to these longer term macro outcomes. So I'm open to ideas when we open up the questions. Now, on the anti-NIC side, looking at these anti-corruption efforts now, so we expected to have the complete opposite effect. We should see big rebounds in growth from these anti-corruption drives. Everything should go well. And indeed, actually, in the short run, we did see positive effects on stock market returns, abnormal returns, on stock market volatility falls. You get an appreciation in the exchange rate. However, these peter off quite a bit faster than we saw in the instance of the corruption case. And this was a really bad place to end, especially with this growth impact, because what's the takeaway? So we're always thinking, what do we say to policymakers from these results? It says corruption stories are very, very bad, and to the extent that you try and counter them with a huge anti-corruption drive, it's not going to work. So what do? We smash the corruption stories. And of course, we didn't want to end there with that very, very bad policy advice. And so we did a lot of investigation into what the interaction effects might be with other reform-minded things that might be happening at the same time. And we found that institutional strengthening efforts, as proxied by the IMF's capacity development that happens across countries, does actually seem to have this positive feedback, in that you do get these positive effects that come through, and they're quite large and large enough to offset that initial negative impact from those major corruption scandals. So what do we take away from this? The first is that to the extent that countries are fighting corruption, it's absolutely well worth the effort. But number two, talk is cheap. So for these anti-corruption major campaigns, it's not enough just to go out there and have a big PR blitz and maybe even get picked up in the international press as having really, really step changed anything there. You really do need to pair it with the harder work, the longer term work of institutional strengthening from within. And I'll leave it there and we can open it up to conversation. Thanks. Questions, comments, ideas? Yeah.
Compare how things might look different in local languages?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a difficulty in the sense that we wanted one dictionary that would be applied across all of our different countries. And so a lot of our human audits in the early stage were all trying to get rid of wobbler words. For example, a scheme in some countries absolutely means corruption, but it can mean a housing scheme or a land scheme, very positive things in other countries. And so we did stick with English and had a very succinct dictionary. However, we did do robustness checks, checking own country sources, both in English as well as in local language. So for the English version that you see on the left-hand side, you see that the spikes largely line up. More interestingly is when we checked own country local language versions, you see that our NIC, the international version, tends to lead the local version. And for the reasons I said before, right? There's less fear of retaliation, there's more funding, independent funding for these international news sources. And then also on the way over, I was talking to Benjamin, there's a Sandile paper on Russia. And what they were showing is that hedge funds actually will leak information to the international press because the institutions domestically are so weak and are unwilling to say anything. And then once the international papers report about it, it then gets reported locally. And so there might be some of that going on as well. Yeah.
Sorry, did you mention how you train the dictionary?
Yeah, so we didn't use, for instance, any machine learning in this instance, and I've done a lot of work in the policy uncertainty literature, and there we found that the machine learning approaches relative to the human approaches actually tend to line up. And so in this instance, we went with kind of a human approach to this. That was also to make sure that we were leveraging the country desk's expertise. And that just means that they're more likely to use it in their actual policy work, and they can actually translate that to the authorities as well. So there was a policy question also in terms of our approach. And from the prior literature, we haven't seen major differences.
So this was based on individual words, phrases?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a Boolean equation with a bunch of locational restrictions. We also, again, did reach out to professors of journalism as well as practicing journalists at the FT as well as CBS to get a sense of whether we were getting the locational restrictions right in terms of how stories should be written, if it's a lead article, for example, about something. Yeah.
How does your work account for what the catalysts are for the news coverage of corruption? Because generally, news coverage of corruption involves one of two factors. One is the officials in a certain country issue an indictment or arrests, and then journalists cover that.
Yeah.
That's probably the more common route. The other, but that I would assume is typical in countries where the authorities have the will to crack down on corruption.
Exactly.
Of course, doesn't exist everywhere. The other catalyst, which is probably somewhat less likely, is when journalists are independent-minded enough to pursue investigations of corruption themselves and to produce news stories that come out of that kind of independent work journalistically. Does your work account for how for those two differences or disparate ways of news stories being generated?
Yeah, so we have not looked into the drivers of the news stories themselves, other than to discount arguments that they are business cycle driven or political cycle driven. But the only way that we were able to get at that, and it's imperfect absolutely, was by looking for any mention of opposition within the coverage of the article. But there is this question of how the journalist, if it's not politically driven, even if it's not, for instance, a political purge, like how are they getting these stories? And generally, it should be coming from local sources that first do a big expose of some sort, and then it explodes internationally if it's macro critical enough. And so that's the only linkage we can make, but we can't distinguish between that initial prompt to do the story. Yeah. No, but it's absolutely fascinating for future research. I mean, that's also we would need so much more information about how the industry works in terms of the nuance there. Yeah, please.
So there is some recent literature documenting that the policy uncertainty has negative risk premium. And I'm just wondering, what is your relationship between the next measure and the policy uncertainty? Also, how does it, whether it is highly correlated with sentiment?
Yeah, so in a way, no, because policy uncertainty tends to be a leading indicator for business cycles and all sorts of things. In this instance, even though we see the growth impact, we don't see the traditional link to the business cycles. And when you kind of line it up and map out the business cycles and see when there are spikes, there doesn't seem to be a link there. We also, in some of our specifications, do control directly for policy uncertainty and see that the impact of the NIC does survive, although it is somewhat lower. And so that kind of gives us some, certitude that we are picking up something very different than policy uncertainty. Yeah. But in terms of sentiments, yeah, so absolutely it should feed into sentiments. We haven't looked into that though, but the fact that we're getting those high frequency financial effects suggests that it is negatively impacting sentiments. Yeah, absolutely. It's worth looking into there.
I wonder if you've looked at reputation effects of different news outlets and if the impact is different. The other thing I wanted to mention, because of the Zingala's article you talked about, is I've heard actually that hedge funds can come out with leaked information about corruption that can be true, and sometimes it's not true, and they're just trying to move things in the short run. So that might be a fun thing to look at and see if you can kind of tease out if the effect is similar or long. If it's if the news is persistent, does that backwards predict that it would have had a bigger shock, or can people tell the difference?
Yeah, if it's real or not. So in our instance, we don't distinguish between it being factual stories. So even if there is an indictment, for example, it might be that the person is eventually vindicated. And so our channel is just that the story, the news actually itself, impacts the beliefs, and that's what filters through. There is an article by Razika and Tonello that absolutely shows that many of the stories are wrong, and yet they do influence outcomes in terms of behaviors on the ground, at least in the Italian instance. In terms of the hedge funds pushing fake stories, that probably could be the case. Again, we limit it to the major sources in order to try and take out the unvetted nature of things, wherein you're not just going to take one hedge fund story, you're going to at least kind of poke around a bit more through the editorial process, and that was the hope in terms of dealing with that. Yeah. And what was your first question? Yeah, so I guess part of my answer then related to that in terms of only using major sources. So these are the papers of record, if you will, across the different economies. And so they do have positive reputations. Is your question more that their reputations after reporting on stories would be damaged? Because they're all international papers as well.
I was asking if you see a differential effect of stories reported by
reputable newspapers versus non-reputable newspapers. Yeah. So that's an interesting way forward, especially in terms of the anti-corruption work. So if you have very, very strong reputational papers versus the others, to see whether there is less of an effect from that. And we haven't explored that yet, but I really like that idea. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there a distinction between when the event happens and when the news is written about the event? Like,
Yeah.
Which is the causal? Like, does the effect that you see start with the event or with the news?
Yeah. So we're doing it based on news, and so you saw actually this is something we were like, maybe what's happening here. So there is in this GDP growth impact, for instance, you see that the drop happens a year beforehand. Right, so we have this pre-period trend happening. It was like, oh no, but that might exactly be that there's major corruption going on, which is distorting things, and then the news only picks it up a year later, and then it persists and it filters through, et cetera. So that might be what's happening there. We can't discount that, but it does seem that the news on its own has an additional effect, which we can pull out from the panels. Yeah, and we've done Jordas to going forward and backwards, and you don't see the pre-period effect there. Yeah, news still matters. I was like in line with the theme of the conference. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.